Snow falls gently outside as a 65-year-old woman stands alone on a frozen sidewalk, her worn suitcase beside her, watching the porch light of her daughter's house disappear as the door slams shut with finality. The Christmas wreath still hangs, mockingly on the door, where moments before, Melody Bryant had just thrown her own mother out into the December cold. After 30 years of single motherhood, after sacrificing everything to raise Melody and help her build this perfect suburban life, after moving in to help with babysitting and household expenses when times got tough, Cecilia Owens never imagined she'd spend the week before Christmas homeless and heartbroken. But what Melody didn't know, what no one knew, was that tomorrow morning, a certified letter would arrive at the law office downtown. A letter containing a $4 million medical malpractice settlement check with Cecilia's name on it. And she was about to teach her ungrateful daughter the most expensive lesson about family loyalty that money could buy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd spend the week before Christmas in a budget motel room, staring at water, stains on the ceiling while Christmas carols played through paper-thin walls. But there I was, Cecilia Owens, 65 years old, clutching a room key to the Sunset Motor Lodge, trying to process how my life had unraveled so completely in the span of a single afternoon. The motel was a far cry from the warm, inviting home I'd been living in just hours earlier. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale cigarettes, despite the prominent no smoking sign on the door. The bedspread was faded and worn, probably unchanged since the 1980s, and the heating unit, under the window, rattled like a freight train every time it cycled on. But it was all I could afford on my limited Social Security income, especially after the financial blow I'd just endured. My hands still shook as I set down my single suitcase, hastily packed with whatever I could grab during those terrible final moments at Melody's house. Inside were a few changes of clothes, my medications, the worn photo album documenting Melody's life from infancy to her wedding day, and the small jewelry box that had been my mother's. Everything else I owned was still sitting in what had been my bedroom at 847 Maple Avenue, the house where I'd been living for the past 18 months, believing it was my home too. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same motel where I'd stayed 31 years ago when I first arrived in Willowbrook, a scared single mother with a 2-year-old daughter and nowhere else to go. Back then, I'd been fleeing an abusive marriage with nothing but hope and determination to build a better life for Melody and myself. Now, decades later, I was back where I started, alone, displaced, and wondering how I'd failed so spectacularly. The Christmas lights from the gas station across the street blinked red and green through my window, a cheerful display that felt like mockery given my circumstances. Tomorrow was December 23rd. In less than 48 hours, families would be gathering around Christmas trees, sharing meals, exchanging gifts, and celebrating together. Instead, I'd be spending the holiday in this depressing room, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life at an age when most people were enjoying retirement with their loved ones. I pulled out my phone and stared at the last text message I'd received from Melody, sent just 3 hours ago. "Mom, I meant what I said. Don't come back. We need our space. You'll figure something out. You always do." The casual cruelty of those words still took my breath away. 24 words that had effectively ended our relationship and left me homeless during the most difficult time of year to find housing. The worst part wasn't even the eviction itself. It was the coldness in Melody's eyes when she'd delivered her ultimatum. The daughter I'd raised single-handedly, who I'd worked 3 jobs to support, who I'd helped through college, through her wedding planning, through the difficult early years of her marriage, had looked at me like I was a stranger. Like I was an inconvenience she needed to dispose of rather than the mother who had sacrificed everything for her happiness. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank app. I checked my balance with growing dread. $127.43. That was it. That was all I had to my name after paying for 3 nights at this motel. The room rate was $39 per night, the cheapest I could find in Willowbrook, which meant I had enough money for about 3 more days before I'd be completely destitute. After that, I didn't know what would happen. Homeless shelters maybe, if they had space. The thought of spending Christmas in a shelter made my stomach turn. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, I'd been living comfortably in my small apartment on Pine Street, enjoying my retirement after 43 years as a school secretary at Willowbrook Elementary. I had modest savings, my Social Security, and a small pension that allowed me to live independently. I wasn't wealthy, but I was secure. Then Melody had called with tears in her voice, explaining that her husband Trevor's consulting business was struggling, that they were behind on their mortgage, that they might lose the house they'd worked so hard to buy. "Mom, we don't know what else to do," she'd sobbed over the phone. "The bank is threatening foreclosure. We've tried everything. Would you consider moving in with us? Just temporarily? We could really use help with the bills, and you know how much little Emma loves having Grandma around." It seemed like the perfect solution. I could help my daughter's family through their financial crisis while spending more time with my 4-year-old granddaughter. I'd sold my apartment, giving Melody and Trevor $50,000 from the proceeds to catch up on their mortgage payments. The rest went into a joint savings account to help with household expenses. I'd moved into their spare bedroom, taking over cooking duties, cleaning, and babysitting while they worked to get back on their feet. For 18 months, I'd been the perfect live-in grandmother and housekeeper. I'd wake up at 6 a.m. to make breakfast and pack lunches. I'd drop Emma off at preschool and pick her up in the afternoons. I'd have dinner ready when Melody and Trevor came home from work. I'd do the laundry, maintain the garden, and handle most of the household management that kept their busy lives running smoothly. In return, I'd asked for nothing except to be treated as part of the family. But somehow, over those 18 months, my presence had gone from welcomed to tolerated to resented. Trevor had started making snide comments about 3 generations under one roof and how they never had privacy anymore. Melody had begun treating me more like hired help than her mother, giving me orders rather than making requests, criticizing my cooking or cleaning methods, and excluding me from family decisions. The breaking point had come that afternoon when I'd overheard Melody talking to her friend Jessica on the phone. "I can't stand it anymore, Jess. She's always here, always watching, always commenting on how we're raising Emma, and Trevor is starting to resent the situation too. We're 35 years old, and we feel like we're living with our parent again. Something has to change." When I'd tried to discuss what I'd heard, suggesting that maybe we could establish some boundaries or that I could look for a small apartment nearby, Melody had exploded. All the resentment she'd been harboring came pouring out in a torrent of accusations and complaints. I was too involved in their parenting decisions. I was making Trevor uncomfortable in his own home. I was setting a bad example for Emma by being too available and not maintaining my own independence. Besides, she'd added with a coldness that still chilled me, "Trevor's business is doing much better now. We don't really need your financial help anymore. We need our space back." When I'd pointed out that I'd given up my apartment and had nowhere else to go, that I'd contributed $50,000 to save their house, Melody had shrugged dismissively. "That was your choice, Mom. No one forced you to sell your place. And that money was a gift to help family, wasn't it? You can't hold it over our heads forever." The casual way she'd dismissed my sacrifice, the way she'd rewritten history to make my generosity seem manipulative, had been more devastating than any physical blow. This wasn't the daughter I'd raised. This wasn't the young woman who used to call me her best friend, who'd included me in every major decision, who'd once told me she hoped she could be half as good a mother as I'd been to her. Now, sitting in this dreary motel room with Christmas approaching and my future uncertain, I wondered where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too giving? Too available? Had I somehow enabled the very selfishness that was now destroying our relationship? Or had success and financial recovery simply revealed aspects of Melody's character that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface until she no longer needed my help? My phone rang, startling me out of my dark thoughts. For a moment, my heart leaped, hoping it might be Melody calling to apologize, to invite me back, to admit she'd been cruel and thoughtless. But the caller ID showed my friend Adeline Reed, probably calling to check on me after I'd texted her earlier about needing a place to stay temporarily. "Cecilia, honey, how are you holding up?" Adeline's warm voice was a lifeline in the darkness. "I've been better," I admitted, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I'm at the Sunset Motor Lodge for now. It's not exactly the Ritz, but it's a roof over my head. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This is insane, Cecilia. After everything you've done for that girl. Listen, my guest. Room is small, but you're welcome to stay here until you figure out your next move." The offer brought tears to my eyes. "Adeline, you're sweet, but I can't impose. You've got your own family coming for Christmas. Family takes care of family. And you're like a sister to me. Besides, my kids would love to see their honorary Aunt Cecilia." As we talked, making plans for me to move my things to Adeline's house the next day, I felt the first glimmer of hope I'd experienced since this nightmare began. I wasn't completely alone. I had friends who cared about me, who saw my worth even when my own daughter didn't. But what Melody didn't know, what no one knew, was that tomorrow would bring news that would change everything. Tomorrow I would discover that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the people who think they hold all the power are about to learn that kindness and cruelty both have a way of coming back to you when you least expect it. Before we continue with Cecilia's incredible journey, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Are you Team Cecilia? Or do you think there's more to this family drama than meets the eye? And here's what I really want to know. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you helped turned around and betrayed you? Because what's about to happen in this story is going to make you believe in cosmic justice again. If stories about family betrayal and unexpected comebacks get your heart racing, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, what happens next in Cecilia's story will have you on the edge of your seat. And tomorrow, we've got an even more shocking tale about a woman who discovered her best friend had been stealing her identity for 20 years. But honestly, I don't think anything will top the twist that's coming in Cecilia's story. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, there's got to be more to this story. Maybe Cecilia was being too controlling. Maybe Melody had valid reasons for wanting her space. And you know what? That's fair. Family dynamics are complicated, and there are always multiple sides to every story. But here's the thing about this particular situation. Sometimes people show you exactly who they are through their actions, and Melody's actions were about to reveal something that would shock everyone who knew her. What we're witnessing here isn't just a family disagreement or a misunderstanding about boundaries. This is a story about gratitude versus entitlement, about sacrifice versus selfishness, and about how some people only value you for what you can give them until they don't need you anymore. And while I can't spoil what's coming next, I can tell you that Melody's timing couldn't have been worse, or from Cecilia's perspective, couldn't have been more perfect. See, there's something poetic about the way life sometimes works. You've probably heard the saying, "What goes around comes around." But most of us don't get to see it play out in real time. Most of us don't get front row seats to watch karma deliver a masterclass in consequences. But that's exactly what we're about to witness in this story. And I promise you, it's going to be more satisfying than anything Hollywood could dream up. Think about the people in your own life for a moment. Think about the ones who've always been there for you, the parents who sacrificed their own dreams for yours, The friends who dropped everything when you needed help. The family members who gave until it hurt because they loved you. Now imagine treating those people like they were disposable, like their years of love and sacrifice meant nothing the moment they became inconvenient. How would you feel if you found out someone you'd helped was talking about you behind your back, calling you a burden, planning to throw you out like garbage? That's exactly what happened to Cecilia. And what makes this story so powerful is that she represents millions of people who've been taken advantage of by the very people they've spent their lives helping. How many of you watching right now have parents or grandparents who've given everything to their families, only to be marginalized or forgotten when they're no longer useful? How many of you have been that person yourselves, wondering if kindness is weakness and if selflessness is just another word for foolishness? But here's why this story is different. Why it's going to restore your faith in justice. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that's absolutely incredible. Sometimes the very moment when evil people think they've won, when they're congratulating themselves on how cleverly they've manipulated the situation, that's when life delivers a plot twist that changes everything. And what's beautiful about what's coming next isn't just that Cecilia is about to receive something that will completely flip the power dynamic. It's that she's about to learn something about herself that she never knew. She's about to discover that she's stronger than she ever imagined, that she deserves better than she ever demanded, and that sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to gain the courage to reclaim your power. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. If you suddenly came into a significant amount of money, would you use it to get revenge on the people who'd wronged you, or would you take the high road? It's easy to say you'd be the bigger person when you're not the one who's been betrayed and humiliated. But when you're sitting in a cheap motel room on Christmas week, thrown out by your own daughter after decades of sacrifice, what would you really do? That's the question we're about to explore, and I think Cecilia's answer is going to surprise all of us. Because sometimes being the bigger person doesn't mean letting people walk all over you. Sometimes it means teaching them lessons they'll never forget, in ways they never saw coming. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's dive back into what might be the most satisfying revenge story you'll hear all year. Because sometimes, karma doesn't just knock on your door. It shows up with a $4 million check and a very expensive lesson about treating your mother with respect. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out, because what happens next is going to make you cheer out loud. The next morning arrived gray and bitter cold, with the kind of December wind that cuts right through your coat and settles in your bones. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning on the lumpy motel mattress while trucks rumbled past on the highway just outside my window. Every time I'd started to drift off, reality would crash back over me like a wave. I was homeless, nearly broke, and estranged from my only daughter just days before Christmas. I sat on the edge of the bed at 6:30 a.m., the same time I'd been waking, up at Melody's house to start breakfast and prepare for another day of managing their household. Old habits die hard, I suppose. But instead of padding down the hallway to a warm kitchen filled with the promise of family breakfast, I was staring at a water-stained ceiling in a room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. My name is Cecilia Marie Owens, though most people call me Cece. I'm 65 years old, born and raised in small-town Millbrook, Ohio, before life took me on a winding journey that eventually landed me in Willowbrook, Massachusetts, 31 years ago. For 4 decades, I worked as a school secretary at Willowbrook Elementary, the kind of job that doesn't make you wealthy, but gives you something more valuable, the knowledge that you've made a difference in thousands of young lives. I was the person parents called when their kids forgot their lunch money. I was the one who kept emergency clothes in my desk drawer for playground accidents, who remembered every student's birthday, and who could calm a crying kindergartner with nothing more than a warm smile and a sticker. The teachers relied on me to keep the chaos organized. The principal trusted me with the school's most sensitive information, and the students knew they could count on Mrs. Owens to listen without judgment. Looking back now, I realize that my Job at the elementary school was practice for what would become my life's greatest challenge and greatest joy, raising Melody as a single mother. When I first arrived in Willowbrook in 1993, I was a broken woman fleeing a marriage that had nearly destroyed me. Richard Owens had been everything a young woman dreams of when she's 23 and naive about the ways of the world. Handsome, charming, full of big dreams and bigger promises. We'd met at a church social in Ohio, and he'd swept me off my feet with his confidence and his plans for our future together. He was going to be a successful businessman, he said. We'd have a beautiful home, wonderful children, and the kind of life you see in magazines. For the first few years, I believed every word. Even when his get-rich-quick schemes failed one after another. Even when we moved from apartment to apartment because he couldn't keep a steady job. Even when I had to work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table while he chased his next big opportunity. When Melody was born, I thought becoming a father would change him, would give him the motivation he needed to settle down and build the stable life he'd always promised. Instead, it seemed to make him more restless, more resentful of the responsibilities. That tied him down. He'd disappear for days at a time, claiming he was working on deals that would set us up for life. I'd stay home with baby Melody, counting pennies and making excuses to friends and family about where my husband was and why we never seemed to have enough money. The final blow came when Melody was 2 years old. I'd come home from my job at the local diner to find a note on the kitchen table. "Cece, I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. The baby needs too much, and you're always tired and stressed. I've met someone who understands me better. I've taken what little money we had in savings. Don't try to find me. We're both better off this way. Good luck, Richard." He'd cleaned out our checking account, all $840 that I'd been saving for Melody's second birthday party, and disappeared. No forwarding address, no phone number, no way to contact him even if I'd wanted to. Just like that, I was a single mother with no support system, no savings, and a toddler who kept asking where Daddy went. The shame was almost unbearable. I'd been so sure I'd chosen the right man, so confident that love would be enough to build a happy family. Instead, I'd been abandoned by someone who saw his own daughter as a burden rather than a blessing. The worst part wasn't even the financial struggle that followed. It was the crushing realization that I'd been completely wrong about the person I'd trusted with my heart and my future. That's when I made the decision to start over completely. I'd heard about job opportunities in Massachusetts from a cousin who'd moved there years earlier, and Willowbrook seemed like the kind of small town where Melody and I could build a quiet, stable life together. I packed everything we owned into my aging Honda Civic, said goodbye to Ohio, and drove east with my sleeping toddler in the back seat and enough money for exactly 1 month's rent at the Sunset Motor Lodge. The irony wasn't lost on me that 31C, years later, I was back in the same motel, once again starting over after being abandoned by someone I'd trusted completely. The difference was that this time, the person who'd thrown me away was the very daughter I'd sacrificed everything to protect and nurture. Those early years in Willowbrook had been the most challenging of my life, but also the most rewarding. The job at Willowbrook Elementary had been a godsend. Stable hours, decent benefits, and a work environment that felt like family. Mrs. Patricia Montgomery, the principal at the time, had taken a chance on a single mother with limited work experience, and I'd repaid her faith by becoming the most dedicated employee the school had ever seen. I'd worked there for 43 years, watching thousands of children grow from nervous kindergartners into confident graduates. I'd seen families through crises, celebrations, and everything in between. Some of my former students were now parents themselves, bringing their own children to the school where Mrs. Owens still sat behind the main office desk with her warm smile and endless supply of bandages and encouragement. My coworkers had become my chosen family over the decades. We'd celebrated birthdays and graduations together, supported each other through divorces and illnesses, and created the kind of workplace bonds that sustained us through the challenging moments that come with working in education. When I'd finally retired 3 years ago, the farewell party had filled the school gymnasium with current and former colleagues, students, and parents whose lives I'd touched in small but meaningful ways. Retirement had been an adjustment, but a welcome one. My pension wasn't generous, but combined with Social Security and my modest savings, it had been enough to maintain my independence in the small apartment on Pine Street that I'd called home for over 2 decades. I'd filled my days with volunteer work at the local food bank, tending to my small garden, and spending precious time with Emma, my granddaughter, who'd brought such joy into my golden years. Life had been quiet, but satisfying, until Melody's call 18 months ago changed everything. The desperation in her voice when she'd explained their financial crisis had broken my heart. Trevor's consulting business, which had been thriving for years, had suddenly lost several major clients. Their savings were gone, their credit cards were maxed out, and the bank was threatening foreclosure on the beautiful colonial house they'd worked so hard to buy. "Mom, I don't know what else to do," Melody had sobbed over the phone. "We've tried everything. The bank won't extend our loan, and Trevor's been applying for jobs, but nothing pays enough to catch up on what we owe. We might lose the house. Emma might have to change schools. I feel like such a failure." The pain in my daughter's voice had been unbearable. This was the little girl I'd protected from every disappointment, the young woman I'd cheered through every triumph. The idea of her losing her home, of Emma being uprooted, of the family I'd worked so hard to help create falling apart, it was unthinkable. When Melody had hesitantly suggested that I might consider moving in with them temporarily, it had seemed like the perfect solution. They needed financial help and emotional support. I needed purpose in my retirement and more time with my granddaughter. We could help each other through this difficult period and emerge stronger as a family. I'd sold my apartment without a second thought, giving them the bulk of the proceeds to save their home. The rest of my savings had gone into their household account to help with daily expenses. In return, I'd asked for nothing more than to be treated as a valued member of their family and to have a place where I belonged. For a while, it had worked beautifully. But somehow, over the months that followed, I'd gone from being a welcomed family member to an unwanted burden. And now, sitting in this depressing motel room with my entire life reduced to a single suitcase, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd spent my whole life making the same mistake, loving people more than they were capable of loving me back. My phone buzzed with a text from Adeline. "Good morning, sunshine. I'm making my famous blueberry pancakes for breakfast. Come over whenever you're ready, and we'll get you settled in the guest room. No arguments. You're family now." The message brought fresh tears to my eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. True family, I was beginning to understand, wasn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it was about the people who chose to stand by you when times got tough, who saw your worth when others took you for granted. As I gathered my few belongings and prepared to check out of the Sunset Motor Lodge, I had no idea that this would be the last morning I'd wake up as a woman of modest means. I had no idea that by afternoon, I'd be holding a piece of paper that would change not just my financial situation, but my entire relationship with the daughter who'd thrown me away like yesterday's newspaper. The confrontation that shattered my world had begun so innocuously, I almost missed the warning signs entirely. It was December 22nd, a crisp Tuesday morning that should have been filled with last-minute Christmas preparations and excited anticipation. Instead, it became the day my daughter revealed who she truly was beneath the grateful facade she'd been wearing for 18 months. I'd been in the kitchen since 6:30 a.m., following my usual routine of preparing breakfast and packing lunches for Trevor and Melody before they left for work. Emma was still asleep upstairs. Her preschool closed for winter break, which meant I'd be spending the day entertaining my granddaughter while her parents finished their last workday before the Christmas holiday. It was the kind of day I'd been looking forward to, just Emma and me, baking cookies and maybe starting a craft project for her to give her parents on Christmas morning. The morning had started normally enough. Trevor came downstairs first, showered and dressed in his usual business casual attire, scrolling through his phone while I set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. He barely acknowledged my effort with a grunt of thanks, but that had become typical behavior over the past few months. I'd learned not to expect gratitude for the daily services I provided. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, and household management had somehow become obligations rather than kindnesses. Melody appeared 15 minutes later, looking polished and professional in her navy suit. But there was something different about her demeanor. Usually she'd grab coffee and toast on her way out the door, chatting briefly about her day's schedule or Emma's activities. But this morning she sat down at the kitchen table with deliberate intention, fixing me with a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying an unusual formality that immediately set my nerves on edge. Trevor looked up from his phone, and I caught an exchange of glances between them that made my stomach clench. Whatever this conversation was going to be, they'd planned it in advance. They'd discussed it, probably rehearsed it, and chosen this morning, 2 days before Christmas, to blindside me with whatever they'd decided. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, setting down the dish towel I'd been using to wipe the counters. "What's on your mind?" Melody straightened her shoulders, assuming the business-like posture she used when dealing with difficult clients at her marketing firm. "Trevor and I have been doing a lot of thinking about our living situation, and we've decided that some changes need to be made." The euphemistic language immediately put me on guard. In my experience, when people talked about changes that need to be made, instead of speaking directly, they were usually about to deliver news that would hurt. I sat down across from them, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading. "Well," Melody continued, still not meeting my eyes directly, "when you moved in with us, it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement to help us through a difficult financial period. And we're so grateful for everything you've done, the money you contributed, the help with Emma, all of it. But Trevor's business has really turned around now, and we feel like we're in a position to stand on our own again." I waited for her to continue, but she seemed to be struggling with how to phrase whatever came next. Trevor, apparently losing patience with her diplomatic approach, jumped in with his typical bluntness. "What Melody is trying to say is that we need our space back. We need to function as our own family unit without feeling like we're being watched and judged all the time." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Watched and judged? I don't understand. Have I done something to make you feel that way? "It's not about anything specific you've done," Melody said quickly, shooting Trevor a warning look. "It's just that we're at different stages of life, with different ideas about parenting and household management. And Trevor and I need to figure out our own way of doing things without feeling like we have to consider someone else's opinions all the time." I struggled to process what I was hearing. For 18 months, I'd bent over backward to avoid interfering with their parenting decisions. I'd bitten my tongue when I disagreed with their choices, kept my opinions to myself even when directly asked, and tried to be nothing more than a helpful presence in their home. Yet somehow, I was being characterized as judgmental and intrusive. "I had no idea you felt this way," I said softly. "If I've overstepped boundaries, why didn't you talk to me about it? I would have been happy to adjust my behavior or give you more space." "Because it's not really about your behavior," Trevor said, his tone growing sharper. "It's about the fact that we're adults trying to build our own family, and we can't do that with your parent living in our house, no matter how helpful she tries to be." The casual cruelty of referring to me as your parent, rather than using my name or acknowledging our relationship, struck me as deliberately dismissive. But it was Melody's reaction, or lack thereof, that truly broke my heart. She didn't correct him or defend me. She just sat there, allowing her husband to speak, about her mother like I was an unwelcome stranger. "So what exactly are you asking me to do?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Melody finally met my eyes, and what I saw there was a coldness I'd never seen before. "We're asking you to find your own place to live. We think it would be better for everyone if you moved out and we went back to having a more traditional relationship, visits and holidays and special occasions, but not living together." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant sound of Emma stirring upstairs. I looked from my daughter to my son-in-law, searching their faces for any sign of uncertainty, any indication that they realized the magnitude of what they were asking. But all I saw was resolve, and in Trevor's case, barely concealed irritation that this conversation was taking longer than expected. "When?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well," Melody said, fidgeting with her coffee cup, "we were thinking maybe by the end of January. That would give you time to find a nice apartment and get settled." "January 31st specifically," Trevor added, consulting his phone calendar. "We've already talked to a contractor about converting your room into a home office, and he can start February 1st if we give him the go-ahead." The casual way they discussed erasing my presence from their home, the matter-of-fact planning they'd done without consulting me, felt like a betrayal beyond anything I could have imagined. They'd reduced me to a logistical problem to be solved, a temporary inconvenience that had outlived its usefulness. "I see," I said, struggling to maintain my composure. "And have you given any thought to how I'm supposed to afford an apartment? On my Social Security income, especially after contributing $50,000 to save this house?" The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if they hadn't considered the practical implications of their demand. Melody's confident expression flickered with something that might have been guilt, but it was quickly replaced by defensiveness. "Mom, that money was a gift to help family. You can't hold it over our heads forever, and you're a smart woman. You'll figure out the apartment situation. Maybe you could find a nice senior community with affordable housing." I saw an ad for Sunset, gardens that looked really nice. The suggestion that I should be grateful for the opportunity to live in subsidized senior housing after giving them the bulk of my savings was so breathtakingly insensitive that I actually gasped. But what truly devastated me was the realization that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a decision made in anger. This was a carefully planned eviction, complete with timelines and alternative housing suggestions, delivered with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "Trevor's right about the timing being good," Melody continued, apparently interpreting my silence as acceptance. "The holidays are always crazy anyway, and this way we can start the new year fresh. You could probably find a temporary place to stay until you get something permanent lined up." "A temporary place," I repeated slowly. "You mean like a hotel?" "Well, yeah, or maybe you could stay with one of your friends for a few days. I'm sure Adeline would be happy to help out." The casual assumption that my friendships existed to solve their problems, that other people should bear the burden of their decision to make me homeless, revealed a level of entitlement that took my breath away. But it was Trevor's next comment that shattered any remaining illusion I might have had about their motivation. "The point is, Cecilia, you're a grown woman who needs to take responsibility for her own living situation. We can't be expected to house you indefinitely just because you made some poor financial decisions." Poor financial decisions. That's how he characterized my sacrifice to save their home, my willingness to give up my independence to help their family through a crisis. In Trevor's mind, my generosity had been foolishness, and my current vulnerability was evidence of my failure to plan properly for my own future. I looked at Melody one more time, hoping to see some sign of the daughter I'd raised, the young woman who used to call me her best friend and thank me for every sacrifice I'd made for her happiness. But the person sitting across from me was a stranger wearing my daughter's face, someone who could casually destroy our relationship for the sake of a home office and the illusion of independence. "I understand," I said finally, standing up from the table. "You've made your position very clear. I'll make arrangements to leave as soon as possible." "Good," Trevor said, already returning his attention to his phone. "I'm glad we could work this out like adults." As I walked upstairs to begin the heartbreaking process of packing my life into suitcases, I could hear them resuming their normal morning routine as if nothing significant had happened. Trevor was discussing his afternoon meetings. Melody was checking Emma's schedule for the day, and both of them seemed relieved to have dispensed with the unpleasant business of evicting me from their lives. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that their timing was about to prove spectacularly, cosmically inappropriate. As I sat in that cramped motel room the next morning, staring at the peeling wallpaper and listening to the rumble of 18-wheelers on the highway, I couldn't stop thinking about the sheer magnitude of what I'd given up for Melody's happiness over the years. The $50,000 that Trevor had so casually dismissed as poor financial decisions represented far more than money. It represented decades of careful planning, sacrifice, and hope for a secure future that I'd willingly surrendered to save my daughter's family. The money had come from the sale of my apartment at 412 Pine Street, a cozy two-bedroom unit on the second floor of a converted Victorian house that had been my sanctuary for 28 years. I'd bought that apartment in 1996, 3 years after arriving in Willowbrook as a single mother with nothing but determination and a fierce love for my toddler daughter. It had taken me 2 full years of working double shifts, my regular job at Willowbrook Elementary during the day, plus evening work cleaning offices downtown, to save enough for the down payment. I still remembered the day I'd signed the mortgage papers, how my hands had shaken as I wrote my name on document after document that represented the largest financial commitment of my life. Melody had been 4 years old then, sitting in the lawyer's office coloring in a picture book while I signed away the next 30 years of my financial life. But it had felt like victory, not burden. For the first time since Richard had abandoned us, I was building something permanent for my daughter and myself. That apartment had been our haven through Melody's elementary school years, when she'd come home each afternoon to do homework at the kitchen table while I prepared dinner. The living room had been where she'd practiced her piano lessons, where we'd watched Disney movies on Friday nights, where she'd posed for prom pictures with her date, a shy boy named Michael who'd been so nervous he'd dropped her corsage twice before successfully pinning it to her dress. Every room held memories of the life we'd built together. The small second bedroom where Melody had slept until she left for college, its walls covered with her artwork, achievement certificates, and photos from school events. The kitchen where I'd taught her to cook, starting with simple scrambled eggs and graduating to full holiday meals. The bathroom where I'd braided her hair for school pictures and bandaged her scraped knees after playground accidents. Over the years, I'd poured not just mortgage payments into that apartment, but thousands of dollars in improvements and upgrades. New hardwood floors when Melody was in middle school because she'd complained that the old carpet was embarrassing when friends came over. A complete kitchen renovation when she was in high school because she'd mentioned that her friend Sarah's kitchen was so much nicer than ours. Fresh paint in the living room every few years, always in colors that Melody approved of during her visits home from college. By the time I'd paid off the mortgage in 2021, that apartment was worth $185,000, a small fortune by my standards, and the foundation of what I'd planned to be a comfortable retirement. I'd imagined living there for the rest of my life, perhaps with a caregiver eventually if my health declined, but always in the home that represented my greatest accomplishment as an independent woman. When Melody had called me in tears 18 months ago, sobbing about the foreclosure notice and Trevor's business collapse, giving up that security had seemed like the obvious choice. What good was financial stability if my daughter was suffering? What was the point of a comfortable retirement if my granddaughter might lose her home and have to change schools? "Mom, I hate to ask this," Melody had said through her tears, "but would you consider selling your place and moving in with us? We could really use help with the mortgage, and Emma would love having Grandma around all the time. It would just be temporary until Trevor's business gets back on track. The decision had taken me less than 24 hours. I'd called my real estate agent the next morning and had the apartment on the market within a week. In my eagerness to help, I'd even accepted the first reasonable offer that came in, selling for $175,000 instead of waiting for a better price. Every penny of the proceeds, minus closing costs and real estate fees, had gone straight to Melody and Trevor. But the financial sacrifice had been just the beginning. Moving in with them had meant giving up not just my home, but my independence, my privacy, and ultimately my sense of self-worth. For 43 years at Willowbrook Elementary, I'd been Mrs. Owens, competent, respected, essential to the smooth operation of the school. Parents had relied on my judgment, teachers had sought my advice, and principals had trusted me with increasing responsibilities over the decades. In Melody's house, I'd gradually become something much smaller and less significant. At first, I'd been the helpful grandmother, appreciated for my cooking and childcare abilities. But as the months passed, I'd been relegated to the role of live-in domestic help, expected to perform services without acknowledgement or gratitude. I'd woken up at 6 a.m. every morning for 18 months to prepare breakfast for a family that barely acknowledged my effort. I'd packed lunches with carefully balanced nutrition, only to have Trevor complain if I included foods he didn't prefer. I'd maintained their household, doing laundry, cleaning bathrooms, organizing closets, managing schedules, while they pursued their careers and social lives without a thought for the woman who made their comfortable lifestyle possible. The childcare alone had saved them thousands of dollars over those 18 months. Emma's preschool had only been available until 3 p.m., and after-school care would have cost them $200 per week. I'd picked her up every day, taken her to the library for story time, supervised her playdates, and provided the kind of attentive, grandmotherly care that they couldn't have afforded to hire elsewhere. I'd also taken over most of the household management that had been causing stress in their marriage. Grocery shopping, meal planning, appointment scheduling, home maintenance coordination, all the invisible labor that keeps a family functioning smoothly. Before my arrival, Melody and Trevor had been constantly bickering about domestic responsibilities. After I moved in, their relationship had improved dramatically because I'd absorbed all the tasks that had been sources of conflict. Beyond the practical contributions, I'd provided emotional support during Trevor's most difficult business period. I'd listened to his worries about client relations, offered encouragement when deals fell through, and celebrated with genuine enthusiasm when things started improving. I'd been a sounding board for Melody's work frustrations, a babysitter for their date nights, and a constant source of stability for Emma during a period when her parents were stressed and distracted. Even more painful than the financial loss was the realization of how thoroughly my contributions had been forgotten or dismissed. In their minds, I hadn't been supporting their family through a crisis. I'd been imposing on their hospitality. My presence hadn't been a gift of love and practical assistance. It had been an intrusion that cramped their style and interfered with their autonomy. The most devastating part was recognizing how completely I'd been taken for granted. Not once in 18 months had either Melody or Trevor sat me down to express genuine appreciation for what I was doing for their family. Not once had they acknowledged the magnitude of the sacrifice I'd made or the difference my presence had made in their lives. Instead, they'd grown increasingly resentful of having to share their space with someone whose very existence reminded them of their temporary vulnerability. I'd raised Melody to be independent and self-sufficient, but somehow, I'd failed to teach her gratitude or loyalty. I'd given her everything I had to give, financially, emotionally, practically, and she'd absorbed it all without ever questioning whether she was taking more than she was giving back. In her mind, my sacrifices had been normal, expected, just what mothers do for their daughters. Now, sitting in that depressing motel room with $127 in my bank account and no clear path forward, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake in raising her to expect so much while demanding so little in return. Had I been so focused on providing for her that I'd forgotten to teach her how to provide for others? Had I been so determined to give her the security I'd never had that I'd raised someone who saw generosity as weakness and dependence as failure? The irony was crushing. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be the kind of mother who would never abandon her daughter the way Richard had abandoned us. I'd sacrificed my own comfort, my own dreams, my own financial security to ensure that Melody would never feel unwanted or unsupported. And in return, she'd grown into someone who could casually throw me away the moment I became inconvenient. But what none of them knew, what I'd almost forgotten myself until I'd started going through my papers the night before, was that this story was far from over. Hidden in my important documents folder was something that would change everything, something that would reveal just how catastrophically poor their timing had been. Sometimes the universe has a sense of irony that's almost supernatural. Sometimes the very moment when cruel people think they've won is exactly when fate decides to reveal who's really been holding the power all along. The hours following my eviction had been a blur of humiliation and practical desperation that I wouldn't wish on anyone. After that devastating kitchen conversation, I'd spent the rest of December 22nd in a fog of disbelief, mechanically packing my belongings while trying to process the reality that my own daughter had just made me homeless 2 days before Christmas. The worst part hadn't been the packing itself, but the casual way Melody and Trevor had continued their normal routines while I dismantled my life upstairs. I could hear them laughing with Emma over breakfast, discussing their Christmas Eve plans with Trevor's parents, and making reservations for New Year's Eve dinner as if they hadn't just destroyed our family. Their ability to compartmentalize my pain, to simply move on with their day after delivering such devastating news, revealed a callousness that still took my breath away. When Emma had asked why Grandma was putting all her clothes in suitcases, Melody had explained it away with sickening cheerfulness. "Grandma is going to have her own special place to live now, honey. Won't that be exciting? You can visit her whenever you want." The lie had been delivered so smoothly, with such practiced ease, that I'd realized they'd rehearsed even this part of their plan. My 4-year-old granddaughter, bless her innocent heart, had been thrilled by the prospect of visiting Grandma's special place. She'd helped me fold clothes and pack books, chattering excitedly about having sleepovers and tea parties in my new home. Her enthusiasm had broken my heart because she couldn't understand that her parents were essentially cutting her off from the grandmother who'd been a daily presence in her life for 18 months. The practical arrangements had been humiliating beyond description. When I'd called around to local apartments hoping to find temporary housing, I'd discovered what anyone who's tried to rent on short notice knows. Decent places require credit checks, references, first month's rent, last month's rent, and security, deposits that can easily total 3 months' rent up front. Even the most modest one-bedroom apartments in Willowbrook started at $200 per month, which meant I'd need nearly $4,000 just to get keys to a place. With only $127 in my checking account and no credit cards, I'd paid mine off and closed them. When I'd moved in with Melody to simplify my finances, I'd been completely shut out of the normal rental market. The few landlords who'd even returned my calls had hung up quickly once they'd learned I needed immediate occupancy with minimal upfront payment. The Sunset Motor Lodge had been my only option, and even that had stretched my limited resources to the breaking point. At $39 per night, I could afford exactly 3 nights before I'd be completely destitute. The desk clerk, a kind woman named Maria who'd recognized the desperation in my voice, had quietly mentioned that the weekly rate was $200 if I paid in advance, a small mercy that would give me a few extra days to figure out my next move. But even with the weekly rate, I'd have less than $50 left for food, gas, and any other necessities. I'd gone from being a woman with a comfortable retirement income and a substantial asset in my apartment to being functionally homeless with pocket change to my name, all because I'd trusted my daughter to honor the spirit of our arrangement, even if it hadn't been legally documented. The motel room itself was a daily reminder of how far I'd fallen. The carpet was stained and worn thin in places, the heating unit rattled constantly, and the bathroom fixtures looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The walls were so thin I could hear every conversation from neighboring rooms, including a particularly heartbreaking one from the room next door, where a recently divorced father was trying to explain to his young son over the phone why Daddy couldn't afford to buy Christmas presents this year. Sleep had been nearly impossible. The bed was lumpy and too soft. The pillows were flat and smelled of industrial detergent, and the constant noise from the highway made rest elusive. But even when exhaustion finally overtook me, I'd wake up every few hours with the crushing realization of my situation crashing over me like a wave. Homeless, broke, estranged from my only daughter. At 65 years old, starting over with nothing. The social isolation was almost as devastating as the financial crisis. For 43 years, I'd been part of a community at Willowbrook Elementary. Even in retirement, I'd maintained friendships with former colleagues and stayed connected to the school family that had sustained me through decades of single motherhood. But now, sitting in this depressing motel room, I felt completely cut off from the social networks that had given my life meaning and structure. I'd been too embarrassed to call my former colleagues to explain what had happened. How do you tell people who knew you as competent and self-sufficient that you've been reduced to living in a highway motel because your own daughter threw you out? How do you admit that the retirement security you'd spent decades building had been demolished? In a single morning by the very person you'd sacrificed everything to help? The shame was overwhelming, but it was complicated by a growing anger that surprised me with its intensity. For my entire adult life, I'd been the peacemaker, the accommodator, the person who put everyone else's needs ahead of her own. I'd swallowed countless small humiliations and disappointments because maintaining relationships had seemed more important than asserting my own dignity. But something about the calculated cruelty of Melody's betrayal had awakened a part of me that refused to accept this treatment quietly. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, analyzing every word and gesture for clues about when my daughter had transformed from someone who loved me into someone who could discard me so casually. The planning they'd done behind my back was particularly galling. The contractor consultation, the timeline, the suggestions for where I should live. They'd been orchestrating my removal for weeks, maybe months, while I'd continued to serve their family with dedication and love. The financial discussions with Trevor had been especially revealing. His casual dismissal of my $50,000 contribution as poor financial decisions had exposed a level of entitlement that was breathtaking in its scope. In his mind, my sacrifice had been foolishness rather than generosity, and my current vulnerability was evidence of my failure to plan properly. The man whose home I'd literally saved was lecturing me about financial responsibility, but it was Melody's silence during the most hurtful parts of the conversation that had cut deepest. When Trevor had been most cruel, when he'd spoken about me with such dismissive contempt, she'd said nothing in my defense. The daughter I'd raised to stand up for what was right had sat quietly while her husband insulted and degraded her mother. That silence felt like the ultimate betrayal, worse even than the eviction itself. The practical implications of my situation were becoming more terrifying by the hour. With my lease at the motel ending in 3 days and no prospect of affordable housing, I was facing the very real possibility of sleeping in my car or seeking shelter at the homeless facility downtown. The irony was crushing. The woman who'd spent decades helping families navigate crises was now the one in desperate need of help. I'd tried to maintain my dignity by not reaching out to friends immediately, but as my situation became more desperate, I'd finally swallowed my pride and called Adeline. Her immediate offer of help had been a lifeline, but even that solution was temporary. Her guest room would give me a few weeks to regroup, but it wasn't a permanent answer to my housing crisis. The Christmas timing of the eviction had added an extra layer of cruelty to the situation. While other families were preparing for celebrations and gatherings, I was dealing with homelessness and the complete collapse of my family relationships. The irony of being kicked out during the season of love and forgiveness wasn't lost on me, especially since I'd spent the previous week helping Melody prepare for what was supposed to be our first Christmas as a 3-generation household. I'd already bought and wrapped presents for Emma, Trevor, and Melody, gifts that were now sitting in my motel room like artifacts from a previous life. The expensive art supplies I'd purchased for Emma's growing interest in drawing, the cashmere scarf I'd splurged on for Melody, the bourbon I'd selected for Trevor after remembering his preference from a conversation months earlier. All purchased, with the assumption that we'd be celebrating together as a family, all now serving as painful reminders of how completely I'd misread the situation. As I sat in that dreary motel room on the evening of December 23rd, watching Christmas lights twinkle from the gas station across the street, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that December 24th would bring news that would change everything. News that would transform me from a discarded, vulnerable elderly woman into someone with the power to teach my daughter and son-in-law the most expensive lesson about family loyalty they would ever receive. Sometimes justice arrives with perfect timing, and sometimes the people who think they've won the game are about to discover they never understood the rules at all. Christmas Eve morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that seemed to cut straight through the thin walls of the Sunset Motor Lodge. I'd been awake since 4:30 a.m., unable to sleep through the noise from the highway and the weight of my circumstances pressing down on my chest like a physical force. This should have been one of the happiest mornings of the year. Christmas Eve with my family, watching Emma open one special present before the big day, helping Melody prepare our traditional breakfast of cinnamon rolls and hot chocolate. Instead, I was sitting on the edge of a lumpy motel bed, trying to figure out how to make my remaining $47 stretch until I could move to Adeline's house the next day. She'd insisted on Christmas dinner together, bless her heart, but I knew I couldn't impose on her hospitality indefinitely. At 65, I needed to find a way to rebuild my life from scratch, and the prospect felt overwhelming. I was going through my important papers one more time, trying to organize what little documentation I had left of my former life, when my fingers brushed against something I'd almost forgotten about. Tucked behind my Social Security card and Medicare information was a business card that I hadn't looked at in almost 3 years. Harrison, Kelman and Associates, Attorneys at Law. Below that, in smaller print, specializing in medical malpractice and personal injury. The memory came, flooding back with startling clarity. It had been October 2021, just 2 months after I'd finally paid off my apartment mortgage and was feeling secure about my financial future for the first time in decades. I'd gone to Willowbrook General Hospital for what should have been a routine, outpatient procedure, a simple hernia repair that my doctor, Dr. Samuel Martinez, had assured me would be quick, easy, and completely straightforward. Nothing about that day had gone according to plan. What should have been a 45-minute procedure had stretched into 3 hours after Dr. Martinez had made a critical error during surgery, accidentally nicking my bowel and causing a serious infection that had nearly killed me. I'd spent 2 weeks in intensive care, fighting for my life while a team of specialists tried to repair the damage caused by what the hospital administration had quietly acknowledged was a preventable surgical error. The recovery had been brutal. 3 months of complications, additional surgeries, and a wound infection that had left me weak and debilitated well into 2022. I'd been forced to use all my accumulated sick leave and vacation time, and even then, I'd had to take unpaid leave to fully recover. The medical bills, even with my insurance, had been staggering. The emotional trauma of nearly dying from what should have been routine surgery had taken even longer to heal. Dr. Patricia Henderson, the surgeon who'd ultimately saved my life by correcting Dr. Martinez's mistakes, had been the one to suggest I consult with an attorney. "Cecilia," she'd said during one of my follow-up appointments, "what happened to you was completely preventable. Dr. Martinez made fundamental errors that no competent surgeon should make. You have every right to seek compensation for what you've been through." At the time, I'd been reluctant to pursue legal action. The idea of suing felt uncomfortable, almost unseemly. I'd been raised to accept misfortunes as part of life, to be grateful for what I had rather than fighting for what I deserved. But Dr. Henderson had been persistent, and eventually, she'd connected me with James Harrison, a medical malpractice attorney who'd handled several cases against Willowbrook General. The initial consultation with Harrison had been eye-opening. He'd reviewed my medical records with the intensity of a detective, pointing out multiple instances where proper protocols had been ignored and standard safety measures had been bypassed. "Mrs. Owens," he'd said, looking up from the thick file of documents, "this isn't just a case of medical negligence. This is gross malpractice that could have killed you." And given Dr. Martinez's history, he's had 3 other similar incidents in the past 5 years. The hospital's decision to keep him on staff shows institutional negligence as well. Harrison had explained that medical malpractice cases could take years to resolve, especially when they involved both individual physician error and hospital system failures. He'd warned me that the process would be lengthy, sometimes frustrating, and that there were no guarantees of success. But he'd also explained that cases like mine, with clear documentation of preventable errors and life-threatening consequences, often resulted in significant settlements. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Owens," he'd said. "Based on what I'm seeing here, if we can prove what I think we can prove, you're looking at a settlement that could change your life. We're not talking about enough money to pay your medical bills. We're talking about compensation for pain and suffering, lost wages, permanent physical limitations, and punitive damages that reflect the hospital's negligence in keeping Dr. Martinez on staff despite his history." The case had been filed in early 2022, and for the past 2.5 years, it had proceeded through the slow machinery of the legal system. There had been depositions, medical expert consultations, negotiations, and countless delays. Harrison had kept me informed throughout the process, but as months had turned into years, I'd almost stopped thinking about it actively. It had become background noise in my life, something that might eventually result in a modest settlement that would help with my retirement security. The last time I'd spoken with Harrison had been in August, when he'd called to tell me that the hospital's insurance company was finally showing serious interest in settling rather than going to trial. "They're nervous, Mrs. Owens," he'd explained. "Our medical experts have been devastating in their depositions, and they know a jury would be sympathetic to a retired school secretary who nearly died because of their doctor's incompetence. I think we'll have resolution soon." But soon, in legal terms, had meant months, and as my life had been consumed by the crisis with Melody and Trevor, I'd pushed the lawsuit to the back of my mind. There had been no communication from Harrison's office since late November, and I'd assumed that meant more delays, more waiting, more legal maneuvering that might or might not eventually result in a modest settlement. Now, holding Harrison's business card in my hands in that dreary motel room, I realized I hadn't checked my messages properly in days. The chaos of the eviction, the stress of finding temporary housing, and the emotional devastation of losing my family had left me scattered and distracted. What if Harrison had been trying to reach me? What if there had been developments in the B case that I'd missed? With trembling fingers, I dialed the number on the card. It was Christmas Eve, so I didn't expect anyone to answer, but the automated system allowed me to check for messages. The recorded voice informed me that I had 3 unheard voicemails, all from Harrison's office, all from the past week. The first message, dated December 18th, was Harrison himself. "Mrs. Owens, this is James Harrison. I have excellent news about your case. The hospital has agreed to settle for the full amount we demanded. Please call me as soon as possible to discuss the details and next steps." The second message, from December 20th, was more urgent. "Mrs. Owens, I've been trying to reach you. The settlement paperwork is ready for your signature, and the insurance company wants to close this out before the end of the year. This is a significant settlement, Mrs. Owens. $4.2 million. Please call me immediately. The third message, from December 22nd, the very day Melody had thrown me out, was almost frantic. Mrs. Owens, I'm concerned that I haven't heard from you. The settlement check is ready to be issued, but I need your signature on the final documents. Please call me as soon as you get this message. This is a life-changing amount of money, and we need to finalize everything before the holiday weekend. Sat in stunned silence, staring at my phone as the implications of what I'd just heard began to sink in. $4.2 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. So far beyond anything I'd ever imagined that my brain struggled to process it. While I'd been sitting in this motel room worrying about how to afford my next meal, while Melody and Trevor had been congratulating themselves on ridding their lives of their burdensome mother, I'd been sitting on news that would change everything. So, timing was so perfectly, cosmically ironic that I almost laughed out loud. 24 hours ago, my daughter had kicked me out of her house because she saw me as a financial liability, someone who couldn't take care of herself, a poor planner who'd made bad decisions with money. In her mind, I was a charity case to be disposed of, a burden that interfered with their comfortable lifestyle. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that at the exact moment they were lecturing me about my financial inadequacies, I was less than 48 hours away from becoming a multimillionaire. As I sat there absorbing this revelation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Real, tangible, transformative power. Not the kind that comes from being needed or useful to others, but the kind that comes from having options, having resources, having the ability to make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's convenience. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't thinking about how to survive or where to find temporary shelter. I was thinking about justice, about consequences, and about the very expensive lesson my daughter and son-in-law were about to learn about the true cost of cruelty. My hands were still shaking as I called Harrison's office back, even though I knew it was Christmas Eve and unlikely anyone would be there. To my surprise, James Harrison himself answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Owens." His voice was filled with relief. "Thank God you called. I've been worried sick about you. Where have you been? I've left multiple messages and this settlement can't wait much longer." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrison," I said, still struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. "I've been dealing with a family crisis. I had no idea you'd been trying to reach me. Did you say $4.2 million? That's exactly right. $4.2 million to be precise. Mrs. Owens, this is one of the largest medical malpractice settlements our firm has ever negotiated. The hospital's insurance company finally realized they had no choice but to pay full damages after our medical experts demolished their defense strategy." I closed my eyes, letting the reality wash over me. Less than 48 hours ago, I'd been a woman with $127 in the bank, sleeping in a highway motel because my own daughter had thrown me out like garbage. Now I was about to become wealthier than I'd ever dreamed possible. "What happens next?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to come in and sign the final settlement documents. Normally, I'd ask you to wait until after the holidays, but the insurance company wants this closed out before December 31st for their year-end accounting. Can you possibly come in this afternoon? I know it's Christmas Eve, but I'll be here until 3 p.m. and this really can't wait." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll be there." After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes before calling the one person I knew I could trust with this incredible news. Adeline answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Cece, honey, how are you holding up? I've been thinking about you all morning." "Adeline," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I need to tell you something that's going to sound completely insane. Try me. I told her everything. The missed calls from my attorney, the medical malpractice settlement, the $4.2 million that was waiting for my signature. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Holy mother of pearl, Adeline finally breathed. Cece, are you telling me that while your ungrateful daughter was throwing you out for being a financial burden, you were sitting on a $4 million settlement? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Oh, the irony is just... Adeline started, laughing, a sound that grew from a chuckle to full-blown belly laughter. I'm sorry, I know this isn't funny, but the timing is just so perfect it's almost supernatural. What are you going to do? I honestly don't know, I admitted. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, but first, I need to get to my attorney's office and sign the paperwork. Will you drive me? I don't think I'm steady enough to drive myself right now. Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss this for the world. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While I waited for Adeline, I found myself thinking about something that had been gnawing at me since the settlement revelation. This money represented more than just financial security. It represented validation of everything I'd endured. The near-death experience, the months of painful recovery, the emotional trauma of nearly dying because of someone else's negligence. For 3 years, I'd been told by the hospital's lawyers that my suffering wasn't worth much, that medical complications were just part of life, that I should be grateful to be alive rather than seeking compensation. Now, the same institution that had nearly killed me and then tried to minimize their responsibility was being forced to acknowledge the true cost of their negligence. $4.2 million was their admission that what had happened to me was catastrophic, life-altering, and completely preventable. But more than validation, this money represented something I'd never had in my entire life: true independence. I thought about my marriage to Richard, how his financial failures had left me constantly worried about money, always scrambling to make ends meet. I thought about my years as a single mother, working multiple jobs just to provide basic necessities for Melody, never able to splurge on luxuries or plan for anything beyond the next month's bills. Even in retirement, I'd been carefully managing a modest fixed income, budgeting every expense and living with the constant awareness that one major unexpected cost could derail my financial stability. The decision to sell my apartment and move in with Melody hadn't just been about helping them. It had been about reducing my own living expenses and stretching my retirement savings as far as possible. Now, suddenly, I would never have to worry about money again. Not just comfortable retirement money, but generational wealth that could fund any dream, any goal, any desire I might have. The woman who'd been thrown out of her daughter's house for being a financial liability was about to become independently wealthy beyond most people's wildest dreams. Adeline arrived exactly 20 minutes later, bursting into my motel room with the energy of someone who'd just won the lottery herself. Okay, tell me again, she said, grabbing my hands. How much money are we talking about? $4.2 million. She shook her head in amazement. Cece, do you realize what this means? You're not just financially secure, you're rich. Like, properly rich. You could buy a house with cash. You could travel anywhere in the world. You could help causes you care about. You could... She paused, a sly smile spreading across her face. You could make certain people very, very sorry they treated you badly. The way she said it made something click in my mind. For the past 2 days, I'd been the victim in this story, the abandoned mother, the discarded woman, the helpless elderly person with nowhere to go. But that narrative was about to change completely. The power dynamic that had defined my relationship with Melody and Trevor was about to flip in the most dramatic way possible. What are you thinking? Adeline asked, clearly reading something in my expression. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that my daughter and son-in-law made a very expensive mistake. They threw me out because they saw me as a burden, someone who couldn't take care of herself financially. They lectured me about poor financial planning and told me I needed to take responsibility for my own life. And now I'm about to become wealthier than they'll ever be. The woman they discarded as a charity case is about to have more money than Trevor makes in his entire career. Adeline's grin was positively wicked. Oh, this is going to be good. What's your plan? I don't have one yet, I admitted. But I know one thing for certain. They need to understand that actions have consequences. Real, significant, life-changing consequences. As we drove to Harrison's office, my mind was racing with possibilities. The old Cecilia, the accommodating, peacekeeping, always forgiving mother, would have used this windfall as an opportunity to reconcile with Melody. She would have shown up at their door with news of the settlement and offered to share the wealth, to prove that family was more important than money. But that Cecilia had died in the kitchen of 847 Maple Avenue 2 days ago. The woman who was about to sign papers for a $4 million settlement was someone new. Someone who understood that love without respect was worthless. That generosity without gratitude was enabling. And that sometimes the people you love most need to learn the hardest lessons. I thought about Emma, my sweet granddaughter who was innocent in all of this. Any consequences for Melody and Trevor needed to be carefully planned to protect her from the fallout. But that didn't mean there shouldn't be consequences at all. By the time we pulled into the parking lot of Harrison's law office, I had made a decision. This money was going to change my life, yes. But it was also going to teach my daughter and son-in-law something they clearly needed to learn about the true value of family loyalty. Some lessons I was beginning to understand are worth $4.2 million. Harrison's law office was a study in understated elegance, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that spoke of competence and success. As Adeline and I sat in the conference room waiting for the final paperwork, I felt a surreal disconnect between my surroundings and my current reality. 12 hours ago, I'd been a homeless woman counting my last few dollars in a highway motel. Now I was sitting in a mahogany-paneled room about to sign documents that would make me wealthier than most people ever dream of being. James Harrison entered with a thick folder and a smile that radiated genuine satisfaction. Mrs. Owens, I have to tell you, this settlement represents everything I love about practicing law. Justice served, wrongs made right, and a client who deserves every penny she's receiving. He spread the documents across the conference table, explaining each section with the thoroughness of someone who understood the life-changing magnitude of what we were doing. The settlement breakdown was even more impressive than I'd initially realized. $2.1 million for pain and suffering, $800,000 for medical expenses and lost wages, $500,000 for permanent physical limitations, and $800,000 in punitive damages designed to punish the hospital for their negligence in keeping Dr. Martinez on staff despite his history of dangerous errors. The punitive damages are what really made this settlement special, Harrison explained. Usually, insurance companies fight those tooth and nail. But when our investigation revealed that Dr. Martinez had 3 previous incidents of similar surgical errors, and the hospital had simply moved him to different departments instead of addressing the problem, their legal team knew they were facing potential criminal negligence charges if this went to trial. As I signed each document, I felt like I was signing away my old life and stepping into something completely new. With each signature, the scared, abandoned woman who'd spent Christmas Eve in a motel room was disappearing, replaced by someone with power, options, and most importantly, choices about how to respond to the people who'd wronged her. The check will be electronically transferred to your account within 48 hours, Harrison said as we completed the final signatures. Mrs. Owens, I hope you'll use this money to build the life you deserve. You've been through hell, and you've earned every penny of this settlement. As we left the law office, Adeline was practically vibrating with excitement. Okay, now what? She asked as soon as we were in her car. Are you going to call Melody? Are you going to show up at their house? Are you going to hire a skywriter to announce that the woman they threw out is now worth more than their house? Times 20? I laughed despite myself. I need to think this through carefully. Whatever I do, it has to be strategic. Melody and Trevor made their choice based on what they believed was my financial weakness. They need to understand exactly how wrong they were, but in a way that maximizes the impact. What do you mean? I mean they threw me out because they saw me as a burden, someone who couldn't take care of herself. They lectured me about financial responsibility and poor planning. They made it clear that my value to them was purely utilitarian, useful when they needed help, disposable when they didn't. Adeline nodded grimly. So you want them to understand that they just discarded someone who could have changed their lives forever. Exactly. But more than that, I want them to understand the true cost of cruelty. They didn't just hurt my feelings or inconvenience me temporarily. They destroyed our family relationship and threw away any claim they might have, had to my generosity going forward. As we drove back toward the motel to collect my belongings, I would never spend another night in that depressing room. I found myself thinking about timing and impact. The settlement money would be in my account by December 26th. Melody and Trevor would be spending Christmas with Trevor's parents, probably enjoying their first stress-free holiday now that they'd rid themselves of the burden of caring for me. I know exactly what I'm going to do, I said suddenly. Tell me. I'm going to let them enjoy their Christmas. Let them think they've won, that they've successfully solved their problem of having me around. And then, on December 27th, when they're back from their celebration and settling into their new reality, I'm going to pay them a visit. Are you going to tell them about the money? Oh, I'm going to do much more than that. I'm going to show them exactly what they threw away, and I'm going to make sure they understand that their decision has permanent consequences. Adeline's eyes gleamed with anticipation. This is going to be better than any movie. What's your plan? Over the next hour, as we drove around Willowbrook and I began to process my new reality, a strategy began to form in my mind. It wasn't about revenge exactly. It was about education. Melody and Trevor needed to learn that people have value beyond their utility, that loyalty and gratitude matter, and that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. First, I was going to establish my new financial reality in the most visible way possible. No more careful budgeting, no more modest retirement lifestyle, no more making decisions based on financial limitations. I was going to start living like the wealthy woman I now was, and I was going to make sure that news traveled through Willowbrook's small-town network. Adeline, what's the most expensive restaurant in town? Probably the Willowbrook Inn. Why? Because tomorrow night you and I are going to have dinner there. The most expensive wine, the finest cuts of meat, dessert, the works, and I'm going to pay with a credit card that shows a very healthy balance. Cece, you know how fast gossip travels in this town. If you start spending money like that, Melody will hear about it within days. That's exactly what I'm counting on. I want her to start wondering where I'm getting the money to live like this. I want her to start questioning whether she might have miscalculated my financial situation. But the restaurant was just the beginning. I was also going to start house hunting, not for a modest apartment or senior living facility like Melody had suggested, but for something spectacular. Something that would make it clear that the woman they'd discarded was operating on a completely different financial level than they'd imagined. There's that beautiful Victorian mansion on Elm Street that's been for sale forever, Adeline said, catching on to my train of thought. The one with the wraparound porch and the carriage house. It's been on the market for $800,000. Perfect. I'm going to arrange a viewing and make sure the real estate agent knows I'm a serious cash buyer. In a town this size, that kind of news will spread like wildfire. The psychological impact was crucial. I wanted Melody and Trevor to start hearing rumors about my sudden wealth before I confirmed anything directly. I wanted them to have time to process the implications, to realize the magnitude of their mistake, to understand that they'd thrown away their relationship with someone who could have transformed their lives. But the real message I need to send, I continued, is about Emma. They need to understand that their decision doesn't just affect them, it affects their daughter's future as well. What do you mean? I mean that wealthy grandmothers typically leave their money to their grandchildren. Trust funds for college, down payments for first homes, financial security for the next generation. But wealthy grandmothers who've been treated with cruelty and disrespect might choose to direct their generosity elsewhere. Adeline was quiet for a moment. Cece, are you saying you'd cut Emma out of your will? I'm saying that Melody and Trevor need to understand the full scope of what their decision cost their family. Emma is innocent in all this, and I would never punish her for her parents' choices. But they don't know that. They need to spend some time contemplating the possibility that their cruelty toward me might have cost their daughter millions of dollars in future inheritance. The plan was becoming clearer with each passing mile. I wasn't going to attack Melody and Trevor directly or seek personal revenge. Instead, I was going to let them educate themselves about the consequences of their choices. I was going to live, openly as the wealthy woman I now was, let them connect the dots about what they'd thrown away, and allow them to contemplate the long-term implications of destroying our family relationship. There's one more thing, I said as we pulled up to the motel. I'm going to make a very public, very generous donation to Willowbrook Elementary in honor of my years there. Something substantial enough to get attention, maybe fund a new library, or computer lab. I want the whole town to know that Cecilia Owens has money to share with causes she values. And you want Melody to realize that she could have been one of those causes. Exactly. The message is simple. I have the resources to be extraordinarily generous to people and institutions that have shown me loyalty and respect, but I also have the option to withhold that generosity from those who haven't. As I packed my few belongings for the last time in that dreary motel room, I felt a transformation completing itself. The frightened, abandoned woman who'd checked in 3 days ago was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, someone with the power to make choices based on principles rather than desperation, someone who was about to teach a very expensive lesson about the true cost of treating family like they're disposable. By the time December 27th arrived, Melody and Trevor were going to understand exactly what they'd thrown away. And by then, it would be far too late to get it back. The next 3 days unfolded exactly as I'd planned, with the precision of a chess master moving pieces into position for checkmate. Christmas Day had been spent quietly with Adeline and her family, but December 26th, the day my settlement funds officially transferred, marked the beginning of what I privately called Operation Reality Check. By 9 a.m. that morning, I was sitting in the office of Patricia Morelli, Willowbrook's most exclusive real estate agent, discussing the purchase of the Victorian mansion on Elm Street as a cash buyer. By noon, I was at Willowbrook Bank establishing a new private wealth management account and discussing investment options for multimillionaires. By 3 p.m., I was at the luxury car dealership on the outskirts of town, test driving a silver Mercedes SUV that cost more than most people's annual salary. In a town the size of Willowbrook, this kind of activity doesn't go unnoticed. Patricia Morelli's assistant was married to the bank manager's nephew. The car salesman, Gregory Hayes, went to the same church as Melody's friend Jessica. The private wealth manager, Brian Foster, played golf with Trevor's business partner. Within 24 hours, the news that Cecilia Owens was spending money like someone who'd won the lottery was spreading through Willowbrook's interconnected social networks like wildfire. I'd chosen each activity carefully, not just for its shock value, but for its visibility. I wanted multiple sources feeding information back to Melody and Trevor, creating a crescendo of rumors that would force them to confront an uncomfortable reality. The woman they'd discarded as a financial burden was clearly operating with resources that dwarfed their own. The first crack in their confidence came Tuesday evening. Adeline and I were having our planned dinner at the Willowbrook Inn. Champagne, lobster, and a wine that cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a month, when I spotted Jessica Patterson dining with her husband at a corner table. Jessica had been Melody's closest friend since high school, and I could see her trying to process what she was witnessing. The supposedly destitute grandmother living lavishly just days after being kicked out of her daughter's house. "She's taking pictures," Adeline murmured, noticing Jessica's subtle phone photography. "That's going straight to Melody." "Good," I replied, raising my champagne glass in Jessica's direction with a smile. "Let her wonder." The second crack came Wednesday morning when my phone rang at 8:15 a.m. The caller ID showed Melody's number, the first contact I'd had from her since the eviction. I let it go to voicemail, knowing that desperation would make her message more revealing than any conversation could be. "Mom, it's Melody." Her recorded voice sounded strained, uncertain. "I've been hearing some strange rumors around town about you. Spending money and looking at expensive houses. I don't understand what's going on. Could you call me back? We need to talk." The careful control in her voice couldn't quite mask the underlying panic. For 3 days, she'd been hearing reports that challenged everything she thought she knew about my financial situation. The woman she'd lectured about poor money management was apparently wealthy enough to buy mansion with cash. The mother she'd characterized as financially irresponsible was investing millions and driving luxury cars. I didn't call back. Instead, I continued implementing my strategy. Wednesday afternoon brought what I knew would be the final straw. My meeting with the development committee at Willowbrook Elementary to discuss my donation. I'd arranged to fund a complete renovation of the school library, including new technology, furniture, and a dedicated reading garden, a gift totaling $150,000 that would be announced at the next school board meeting. Mrs. Caroline Williams, the current principal, had been overwhelmed by my generosity. "Mrs. Owens, this is incredible. The children are going to have opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Are you sure you want to make such a substantial commitment?" "I'm absolutely certain," I'd replied. "This school was my professional home for over 4 decades. I want to ensure it continues to provide excellent education for future generations." The announcement would be in Thursday's Willowbrook Gazette, complete with photos and quotes about my significant philanthropic commitment to local education. By Thursday evening, every person in town would know that Cecilia Owens had money to burn and was choosing to spend it on causes that mattered to her. Thursday morning brought a more urgent call from Melody, this one at 7:30 a.m. Again, I let it go to voicemail. "Mom, this is getting ridiculous. I know you're getting these messages. People are saying you bought the Henderson mansion with cash and donated hundreds of thousands to the elementary school. Where is this money coming from? Did you win the lottery? Did someone die and leave you an inheritance? I'm worried about you. Call me back immediately." The "worried about you" line almost made me laugh. She wasn't worried about my well-being. She was worried about the implications of her miscalculation. Every report of my newfound wealth was forcing her to confront the possibility that she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Thursday afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting. Trevor's number flashing on my phone at 2:15 p.m. This time, I answered. "Cecilia." Trevor's voice was tight with barely controlled agitation. "We need to talk. There are rumors going around town that frankly don't make sense, and Melody is beside herself trying to figure out what's going on." "Hello, Trevor," I replied pleasantly. "How was your Christmas? I trust you and Melody enjoyed your first holiday without the burden of having me around." The barb hit its mark. He was silent for a moment before continuing. "Look, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about our conversation last week. Maybe we were too hasty in asking you to move out, but right now, we need to know what's going on with all this money people are saying you have." "Misunderstandings?" I kept my voice level, professional. "I don't recall any misunderstandings. Trevor, you were quite clear that I was a financial burden who'd made poor decisions and needed to take responsibility for my own living situation. You were quite clear that my presence in your home was unwelcome, and that you needed me gone immediately. But where did you get the money for a $750,000 house? That's really none of your business anymore, is it? You made it very clear that my financial situation was my responsibility, not yours. I could hear him breathing heavily, probably trying to control his temper. Cecilia, if you've come into some kind of windfall, don't you think family should know about it? Don't you think there might be ways we could all benefit from whatever good fortune you've had? And there it was, the real reason for the call. Not concern for my well-being, not regret about their treatment of me, but the immediate assumption that my good fortune should somehow benefit them. Even now, even after throwing me out like garbage, Trevor was positioning himself to claim a share of whatever wealth I'd acquired. Family, I repeated slowly. That's an interesting word choice, Trevor. Is that what we are? Because just a few days ago, you made it very clear that I wasn't part of your family unit. You made it very clear that your family needed space from me, that my presence was detrimental to your happiness and your marriage. Now you're just being dramatic. Am I? Let me ask you something, Trevor. If you'd known about my financial situation last week, would you still have kicked me out? The question hung in the air between us. His silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, I continued. You're not calling because you care about my well-being, or because you regret how you treated me. You're calling because you're realizing that you might have made a very expensive mistake. Cecilia, that's not— I'll tell you what, Trevor. Tomorrow is Friday, December 27th. If you and Melody want to understand what's really going on, if you want to know where my money came from and what it means for our family's future, come to my new house at 2 p.m. I'll explain everything. But I want you both to understand something. This conversation will determine the permanent nature of our relationship going forward. What do you mean? I mean that how you've treated me over the past week has consequences. Real, significant, life-changing consequences. Tomorrow, you'll learn exactly what those consequences are. I hung up before he could respond, leaving him to contemplate what tomorrow's revelation might bring. By now, both Melody and Trevor would be frantically trying to piece together the puzzle of my sudden wealth, probably Googling everything from lottery winners to inheritance laws to stock market windfalls. What they would discover tomorrow was that their timing hadn't just been bad, it had been catastrophically, irreversibly expensive. And by the time they understood the full scope of what they'd thrown away, it would be far too late to get it back. The final lesson was about to begin. Friday, December 27th, dawned clear and cold, with the kind of winter light that made everything look sharp and crystalline. I stood in the grand foyer of my new home, my home, adjusting the fresh flowers I'd arranged in the antique vase that had come with the Victorian mansion. At exactly 1:45 p.m., I watched through the tall windows as Melody's Honda Civic pulled into my circular driveway, looking small and ordinary against the backdrop of my new estate. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of moving arrangements, furniture deliveries, and the surreal experience of writing checks without worrying about my bank balance. I'd hired a team of movers to transfer my belongings from Adeline's guest room, purchased furniture to fill the mansion's spacious rooms, and even hired a housekeeper, partly for practicality, but mostly because I could. Now, standing in my elegant living room with its 12-foot ceilings and original hardwood floors, I felt the full weight of how completely my life had transformed. A week ago, I'd been a homeless woman with $127 to her name. Today, I was a multi-millionaire homeowner about to deliver the most expensive lesson about family loyalty that anyone in Willowbrook had ever received. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 p.m. Through the frosted glass, I could see two figures standing on my wraparound porch, and I took a moment to appreciate the symbolism. A week ago, they'd thrown me out of their home, making me stand on a cold sidewalk with a suitcase. Now they were the ones standing outside, waiting for permission to enter my space. I opened the door to find Melody and Trevor dressed in their best clothes, as if this were a job interview rather than a family meeting. Melody's face was pale and strained, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Trevor looked aggressive and defensive, his jaw set in the expression he wore when he felt cornered. "Hello, Melody." "Trevor," I said pleasantly. "Please come in." They stepped into the foyer, and I watched their eyes widen as they took in the grandeur of the space. The crystal chandelier, the marble floors, the sweeping staircase with its carved banister, everything spoke of wealth and permanence that dwarfed their modest colonial. "Mom," Melody began, her voice small. "This place is incredible. Where did you... Please sit down," I said, gesturing toward the living room. "We have a lot to discuss." They settled uneasily on the velvet sofa I'd purchased just yesterday, looking like children called to the principal's office. I remained standing, a position of power I'd never held in our relationship before. "I'm sure you have questions," I began. "You've been hearing rumors about my sudden wealth, and you're wondering how the woman you characterized as financially irresponsible just a week ago could possibly afford a lifestyle like this." Trevor leaned forward aggressively. "Cecilia, we think you owe us an explanation. If you've had money all along and just let us struggle..." "Stop." My voice was quiet, but carried an authority that made him close his mouth immediately. "You'll listen first, then if you deserve it, you can ask questions." I walked to the mahogany side table where I'd placed a folder containing copies of my settlement documents. 3 years ago, I nearly died because of a surgeon's negligence. For 2.5 years, I've been pursuing a medical malpractice lawsuit against the hospital and Dr. Martinez. Last week, the exact same week you threw me out for being a financial burden, my attorney called to inform me that the case had settled. I opened the folder and removed a copy of the settlement agreement for $4.2 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Melody's face went white, then red, then white again. Trevor's mouth fell open as he stared at the document in my hands. $4 million? Melody whispered. $4.2 million to be exact. The money was transferred to my account on December 26th, the day after you spent Christmas celebrating your successful removal of your burdensome mother. Trevor found his voice first. "You've had a $4 million lawsuit pending and you never told us?" "Why would I? You made it very clear that my financial situation was my responsibility, not yours. You lectured me about poor planning and bad decisions. You told me I needed to take care of myself instead of depending on family." Melody was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror, regret, and calculation. "Mom, if we'd known, if you'd just told us about the lawsuit, if you'd known, would you still have kicked me out?" The question hung in the air. We all knew the answer. "I think," I continued, "it's important for you to understand the full scope of what your decision cost you. Not just financially, though we'll get to that, but personally, emotionally, and in terms of your daughter's future." I moved to the window, looking out at the gardens that would bloom spectacularly in spring. You see, I'd been planning to use this money to benefit our family, a trust fund for Emma's education, down payment help when you wanted to upgrade to a larger house, investment in Trevor's business expansion, travel together, experiences we could share, memories we could build. Melody started crying. "Mom, we can still do all of that. This doesn't have to change anything between us." I turned back to face them. "But it already has changed everything, Melody. Because you showed me who you really are when you thought I had nothing to offer you. You showed me that your love was conditional on my usefulness. You showed me that you could discard me without hesitation when I became inconvenient. We made a mistake," Trevor said quickly. "We can fix this. We can apologize and start over." "Can you? Can you really?" I sat down across from them, my voice gentle but firm. "Trevor, when you called yesterday, your first question wasn't about my well-being or whether you'd hurt me. It was about how you could benefit from my good fortune. Even now, even after learning what you threw away, your first instinct is to position yourself to gain access to my money. The truth of it was written all over his face. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. I'm going to establish a trust fund for Emma, one that will ensure she never has to worry about college tuition or her first home. But that money will be managed by independent trustees, not by you. You'll have no access to it, no control over it, and no ability to use it as leverage. Mom, please! Melody started. As for the two of you, you're going to learn to live with the consequences of your choices. I'll maintain a relationship with Emma because she's innocent in all this. But my relationship with you is permanently changed. You wanted independence. From your burdensome mother? Congratulations, you have it. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. I want you to understand something clearly. This isn't about revenge. It's about consequences. You made a choice based on what you believed was my weakness and your strength. You gambled that I needed you more than you needed me. You lost that gamble, and the stakes were higher than you ever imagined. Trevor stood too, his face flushed with anger. So you're just going to cut us off? After everything we've been to each other? After everything you've been to me, I corrected. Because what you've been to me, Trevor, is a son-in-law who took my financial support for granted, resented my presence in your home, and kicked me out on Christmas week. What you've been to me, Melody, is a daughter who forgot that love requires respect, that family loyalty goes both ways, and that some actions can't be undone. Melody was sobbing now. Mom, I love you. We both love you. Please don't do this. If you loved me, you wouldn't have thrown me away the moment I became inconvenient. If you respected me, you wouldn't have lectured me about financial responsibility while living in a house I helped you save. If you valued me, you wouldn't have planned my eviction behind my back like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person who deserved honesty. I walked them to the door, feeling strangely peaceful despite the magnitude of what I was doing. Emma can visit me anytime she wants. In fact, I'm planning to set up a beautiful playroom for her here, and maybe we'll travel together when she's older. But you two will live with the knowledge that you had the chance to be part of something wonderful, and you chose to throw it away for the sake of a home office. As they stood on my porch, Melody made one last desperate attempt. Mom, what if we sell our house and pay you back the $50,000? What if we make this right? I smiled sadly. Melody, this was never about $50,000. This was about respect, loyalty, and love. Those things can't be bought back with money, and they can't be restored with apologies motivated by regret about missing out on wealth. I closed the door gently but firmly, watching through the window as they walked slowly to their car. Trevor was gesturing angrily, probably already blaming Melody for their catastrophic miscalculation. Melody was still crying, finally understanding the true cost of the choice they'd made. As their car disappeared down my driveway, I felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened, abandoned woman who'd spent Christmas week in a highway motel was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, someone who would never again accept love without respect, someone who had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people that their actions have consequences. 3 months later, I was sitting in my garden reading to Emma, who was visiting for our weekly art lesson. She was thriving, as children do, adapting to the new reality where Grandma lived in a beautiful house with a swimming pool and a playroom that looked like something from a fairy tale. Grandma Cece, she said, looking up from her coloring book, Mommy says you're not mad at them anymore, but you're still teaching them a lesson. What kind of lesson takes so long? I smiled, thinking about how to explain adult concepts to a 5-year-old mind. Sometimes, sweetheart, the most important lessons take a lifetime to learn. But the most important one is this: we should treat the people we love with kindness and respect, especially when we think they can't do anything for us in return. Because that's when love is real? Exactly, Emma. that's when love is real. As the sun set over my gardens, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to discover who you really are. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals lead to the greatest transformations. And sometimes, the people who think they're winning are actually teaching you the most valuable lesson of all, that you deserve better than you ever dared to demand. The settlement money had given me financial security, but the real treasure was something that couldn't be measured in dollars. The knowledge that I was worth more than my utility to others, that my value wasn't determined by what I could provide, and that true family is built on respect and loyalty, not convenience and need. At 65 years old, I had finally learned to put myself first, and it turned out that the view from that position was absolutely magnificent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.